Still trying to get rich? My son-in-law Kyle sneered at Christmas dinner, his voice thick with condescension as he nodded toward my laptop. My daughter, Brina, chimed in with a laugh that stung more than it should have. She can't even keep steady work. All of this just because I'd casually mentioned that my online knitting course was finally getting some traction, then perfect timing. As if the universe itself had planned it. The TV news cut-in, local entrepreneur becomes millionaire through an innovative online education platform. My face filled the screen. The room went dead silent. Tell us your city below. Hit subscribe and get ready for today's story. Let's begin. You should have seen their faces. Kyle's fork froze halfway to his mouth, piled high with turkey I'd spent 6 hours cooking. Brenna's wine glass hovered in midair as if she'd turned to stone. Even my grandchildren, Emma and Jake, stopped their usual Christmas chaos to stare at the television, where their supposedly unsuccessful grandmother was being interviewed about her multi-million-dollar business. Margaret Thompson of Cedar Falls has revolutionized online crafting education, the reporter continued, turning her passion for knitting into a business empire worth over $750,000. Her Stitch Your Dreams platform now serves students in 47 countries. I knew the interview was airing tonight. What I hadn't expected was Kyle humiliating me publicly just moments before it came on. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor better than anything I could have written myself. Mom, Brenna's voice cracked. That's you on TV. I reached for my wine glass with steady hands, though inside I was buzzing with satisfaction. Yes, dear, it is. Kyle had turned an unpleasant shade of green, which clashed horribly with his expensive Christmas sweater. The one I noticed still had the price tag carefully tucked inside the collar. $500. I wondered if they'd charged it to a credit card they couldn't afford, just like everything else in their picture-perfect suburban life. But you never said anything, Kyle stammered, his confidence evaporating like steam from the forgotten gravy boat. You never asked, I replied calmly, taking a slow sip of wine. In fact, if I remember correctly, last Thanksgiving you said my little hobby was cute but that I should focus on finding real work. The reporter's voice carried on from the TV. Thompson's success story began during the pandemic, when she lost her teaching job after 30 years. Rather than despair, she chose opportunity. Lost my job. They made it sound so neat. What actually happened was budget cuts forced early retirement on anyone over 50 overnight. I was staring down a future of substitute teaching and food stamps. I hadn't shared those fears with my family. Why burden them with an old woman's problems? The platform started with just 12 students, the report continued. Today, it boasts more than 50,000 active learners and partnerships with major craft retailers. Worldwide, 50,000 students. I let the number hang in the air while Kyle tried and failed to process it. This was the same man who'd suggested just last month that I consider moving into a senior community, because maintaining a house is probably a lot at your age. During filming, the reporter had asked me, what advice would you give to people starting businesses later in life? I remembered my answer perfectly. Don't let anyone convince you your best years are behind you. And never ever let family treat you like you're already dead just because you've passed 50. Brina set her wine glass down with trembling hands. Mom, why didn't you tell us? We're your family, are you? I wanted to ask. Family doesn't usually turn dinner into a competition to see who can land the cruelest joke about your failures, but I kept my composure. Well, I said pleasantly. You seemed so certain it would never amount to anything. I didn't want to get your hopes up. The interview ended with footage of my home office, the very room where Kyle once sarcastically suggested I install a ramp for when the arthritis gets worse. The camera glided past my awards, my computer setup, and a wall filled with thank you letters from students all over the world. This Christmas certainly took an unexpected turn, I said, calmly cutting myself another slice of pie. Anyone else want dessert? The silence stretched like taffy. You could practically hear the gears grinding in Kyle's head as he tried to rewrite every interaction we'd had over the past 3 years. Meanwhile, Brina kept glancing between me and the television, as if expecting one of us to disappear like a mirage. Grandma, Emma piped up with the brutal honesty only 7-year-olds possess. Daddy said you were poor and couldn't afford nice things. But millionaires aren't poor, right? From the mouths of babes, Kyle's face flushed a deep, furious red, and I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. Children have a remarkable gift for exposing adult hypocrisy without even trying. No, sweetheart, I said gently. Millionaires aren't poor. Would you like some ice cream with your pie? Yes, please, she said. The expensive kind. Even 5-year-old Jake seemed to sense that something important had shifted in the family. He kept staring at me like I'd suddenly grown wings, which honestly wasn't far from how I felt. Kyle cleared his throat, clearly deciding it was time for damage control. Maggie, this is incredible news. Truly incredible. Maybe we should talk about how we can help you manage all of this. There it was. Less than 10 minutes after learning about my success. And he was already positioning himself as my financial advisor. The audacity was almost impressive. Manage what, exactly? I asked, carefully spooning ice cream into Emma's bowl. Well, you know, investments, tax planning, making sure you don't get taken advantage of by unscrupulous people like him. Perhaps I'd noticed how his eyes lit up when the reporter mentioned $750,000. I could practically see him calculating his share of my hypothetical inheritance. Probably already planning that kitchen renovation they'd been talking about for months. I appreciate the concern, I said calmly. But I already have excellent financial advisors. I've had them for 2 years. 2 years, let that sink in. 2 years during which they joked about how much time I spent on my computer. 2 years of suggestions that I find something more age-appropriate: gardening, birdwatching. 2 years while I was building an empire and they were building assumptions about my limitations. Brina finally found her voice. Mom, I'm sorry about what we said earlier. We just didn't understand. Understand what? I asked. That a 54-year-old woman might be capable of learning new technology? That someone you'd written off as past her prime might actually be hitting her stride? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. But after years of swallowing their condescension, having it out in the open felt like lancing an infected wound. We never wrote you off. Kyle protested, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. Really? I said. Because last month you suggested I get tested for early onset dementia because I didn't return your call within 6 hours. 6 hours. Kyle. To his credit, he looked uncomfortable. I was just concerned. You were concerned about my mental capacity, I replied. But it never occurred to you to be concerned about my financial capacity. Interesting priorities. Emma, bless her heart, was listening intently while methodically eating her ice cream. Children are natural observers of adult drama, quietly filing away every contradiction for later. What does millionaire mean? Jake asked suddenly. It means grandma has lots and lots of money, Emma explained with authority. More than daddy. Much more than daddy. If the whispered phone calls about credit card debt I'd overheard were any indication. But I wasn't ready to drop that particular truth just yet. Money isn't everything, Brina said quickly, shooting Emma a warning glance. No, I agreed. But respect is. And it's remarkable how much easier respect becomes when people can't dismiss you as financially irrelevant. Kyle was clearly uncomfortable now. He kept fidgeting with his phone, probably calculating how to turn this new reality to his advantage. I'd seen that look before, usually right before he suggested ways I could be more helpful to their household. Maybe we should talk about this privately, he suggested, glancing pointedly at the children. Why? I asked. Are you planning to say something you wouldn't want them to hear? The question hung in the air like smoke, because that was exactly what he'd been planning, wasn't it? A quiet conversation about family, about sharing good fortune, about how my success was really everyone's success, about how surely I'd want to help my daughter and her family achieve their dreams. I stood and began clearing the dessert plates, noting with quiet satisfaction that Kyle had barely touched his pie. Stress eating, apparently, was only for the poor. You know what the best part of tonight has been? I said casually as I stacked the dishes. Watching you both realize you've been talking down to someone you should have taken seriously all along. That's when I knew this was only the beginning. 3 days after Christmas, my phone started ringing and it didn't stop. The first call came from Brina at 8:30 that morning, just as I was easing into my routine, coffee in hand, answering emails from students scattered across different time zones. There's something grounding about starting the day with messages of gratitude, like a grandmother in Australia proudly sharing photos of the first sweater she'd ever finished. Mom, I've been thinking, Brina said, skipping any sort of greeting, about Christmas dinner and how we reacted to your news. I'd been expecting the call. 72 hours was apparently just enough time for them to process my financial independence and plan a response. Have you now? I replied, opening an email from my accountant about quarterly tax payments. Turns out being wealthy comes with an impressive amount of paperwork. We handled it badly, she continued. Kyle feels terrible about what he said, and I realize I've been treating you like you're helpless instead of acknowledging how capable you are. The words sounded rehearsed, like something she'd practiced in front of a mirror. Knowing Brina, she probably had. She'd always been my dramatic child, the one who could summon tears on cue when she wanted something. I hummed non-committally while scrolling through my business calendar. A video conference with my web developer at 10. a potential partnership meeting with a European craft supplier after lunch. A very full schedule for a supposedly helpless senior citizen, so she continued. We were wondering if you'd like to come to dinner this weekend. Just us, family time. Kyle's making his famous lasagna. The same recipe he'd copied from my kitchen after I made it for them last year, and then claimed he'd perfected himself. The irony of him offering my own dish as a peace offering wasn't lost on me. That's very thoughtful, I said evenly. But I'm actually busy this weekend. Busy? The surprise in her voice bordered on insult. What, exactly, could a 54-year-old grandmother possibly have going on? I'm flying to New York for a business meeting, I added. Potential investors for the next expansion of my platform. Silence. Then, you're flying to New York for business? Yes, dear. People who run businesses often travel for meetings. It's quite common. I could almost hear her recalibrating. In the space of one holiday dinner, I'd gone from unemployed burden to some sort of mysterious business mogul. The mental whiplash must have been exhausting. Well, what about the following weekend? I'll check my calendar and let you know. After we hung up, I allowed myself a small smile. The truth was, I was busy this weekend but not with business travel. I was having lunch with my neighbor Dorothy to celebrate her granddaughter's college acceptance. Then spending Saturday evening at a wine tasting with my book club. Simple pleasures I'd been free to enjoy ever since I stopped organizing my life around other people's convenience. The second call came from Kyle at noon. Just as I was wrapping up a video conference about adding live virtual workshops to my platform. Clearly, he'd drawn the short straw for the next attempt. Maggie. Hey, it's Kyle, as if I didn't have caller ID. Listen. I just wanted to apologize personally for Christmas. That was really out of line. Yes, it was. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. He'd spent 3 years treating me like a charity case. Now he wanted absolution simply because he'd discovered I wasn't actually pitiable. I guess I just didn't realize how successful your business had become, he continued. You're so modest about your achievements. Modest. A generous way to describe staying silent while they joked about my financial irrelevance. I wasn't being modest, Kyle, I said calmly. I was protecting myself. Protecting yourself from what? From this exact conversation, I thought. From the moment affection becomes conditional. From watching love shift the second usefulness enters the equation. From realizing my worth to the family depended more on my bank balance than my humanity. From this, I said simply, that's not I mean we don't, he faltered. Because we both knew that was exactly what was happening. Kyle, I continued. 3 weeks ago you suggested I downsize into a senior apartment. Because maintaining a house was probably getting to be too much for me. Yesterday, you texted asking if I'd looked into investment opportunities lately. What changed? His voice trailed off. What changed, Kyle? I said quietly. Is that you see dollar signs when you look at me now? And that tells me everything I need to know about what I meant to you before. That's not fair. Is it? I said, when was the last time you called me just to chat? When was the last time you asked about my interests without rolling your eyes? When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of an obligation? He couldn't answer because we both knew the truth. Never. Look, he said finally. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot over the years, but we're family. Family supports each other. There it was, the magic word, support, in Kyle's speak. That meant subsidizing their lifestyle while pretending it was about love. You're absolutely right, I said sweetly. Family should support each other. It's just fascinating how that suddenly became important to you. After you found out I could afford it, I hung up. Before he could respond, and I was grinning, thought this was better than any soap opera I'd ever watched. I knew tomorrow would bring call number 3. And I was genuinely curious which angle they'd try next. Call number 3 came from an unexpected source. Grandma? It's Emma, Grandma Maggie. Her 7-year-old voice was unusually serious, the tone children use when they're delivering messages from adults who don't want to make the call themselves. Hello. Sweetheart. How are you? I'm good. Mommy said I should call you because you might be sad that we haven't talked since Christmas. Double quotes. Guilt deployment via grandchildren. I had to admire the strategy, even as it annoyed me. Using Emma as an emotional weapon was a new low, even for them. I'm not sad, honey. I've just been very busy with work. Daddy says you're really rich now, she continued. And that rich people don't have time for family. I closed my eyes and counted to 5. The fact that Kyle was poisoning my granddaughter's view of wealthy people to justify his own behavior was breathtaking in its manipulation. Emma. Sweetheart, I said carefully, being rich doesn't mean you love your family any less. Sometimes adults just make things more complicated than they need to be. Are you mad at mommy and daddy? Out of the mouths of babes again. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that you're not angry so much as deeply disappointed? That the people who claim to love you spent years treating you like a burden, only to suddenly take interest once they realized you could afford nice things? I'm not mad, I said gently. But I am sad that it took them this long to realize I'm not someone who needs to be taken care of. I never thought you needed taking care of, Emma said matter-of-factly. You make the best cookies, and you know how to fix my tablet when Daddy can't. Smart girl. She'd noticed what the adults had missed. I'd been taking care of everyone else for years. Emma, can you put Mommy on the phone for me? She says she's in the shower, Emma replied. But I heard her whisper that I should talk to you first to see if you're still angry. Of course she did. Heaven forbid Brina face an uncomfortable conversation head-on when she could send her daughter ahead as a scout. Tell Mommy I said using you to test my mood isn't fair to you, I said. If she wants to talk to me, she should call me herself like a grown-up. What does that mean? It means you shouldn't have to worry about whether adults are upset with each other. That's not your job. After I hung up with Emma, I sat alone in my office, staring at my computer screen. The business was thriving beyond anything I'd ever imagined. Students from around the world sent me thank you notes. Partnerships with major craft companies were forming. I had respect in my industry and a level of financial freedom I'd never thought possible. So why did I feel so empty when it came to my family? The answer came quietly but clearly. I was grieving a relationship that had probably never existed the way I believed it had. I'd thought Brina and Kyle loved me for who I was. Their recent behavior suggested they'd simply tolerated me out of obligation. The money hadn't changed me, it had exposed who they'd been all along. My phone buzzed with a text from Brina and Emma said you were upset about her calling. That wasn't my idea. Kyle thought it might be nice for you to hear from the kids. Even the apology was a deflection. Kyle's idea, not hers. Never any real accountability, I typed back. Using children as messengers in adult conflicts is inappropriate. Regardless of whose idea it was, her response came almost immediately. We're trying to rebuild our relationship here. Can't you meet us halfway? Halfway. As if 3 years of condescension and dismissal could be split down the middle like a dinner check. As if my hurt feelings were just as responsible for their behavior as their ongoing disrespect. I typed several responses. Deleted all of them. What was the point? They didn't want insight into my feelings, they wanted access to my money. They didn't want accountability, they wanted forgiveness without understanding what they'd done wrong. Eventually, I settled on this. I'm not interested in rebuilding the same relationship we had before. If you want a new one, it starts with treating me like an equal, not like a problem to be managed or a resource to be accessed. There was no reply. And that told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. That evening, I opened a bottle of good wine, ordered takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant, and spent 2 hours on a video call with my business partner discussing expansion plans for the European market. It was productive, engaging, and a welcome reminder that there were people in the world who valued my intelligence and treated my time as something precious. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Kyle standing on my porch, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers, the kind you grab from a bucket near the checkout counter when you remember at the last minute that you're supposed to make an effort. I didn't open the door. Instead, I watched him stand there for 5 minutes, shifting his weight from foot to foot before finally placing the flowers on my doormat and walking away. The card tucked among the already wilting carnations probably contained an apology full of good intentions and references to my unreasonable expectations. I left the flowers where they were. By morning, they'd be as wilted as his chances of easy access to my bank account. 2 weeks later, they made their real move. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when the doorbell rang at 7:30 a.m. Too early for a social visit. Too insistent to be a delivery driver. When I opened the door, Brina stood there with mascara streaked down her cheeks, Jake balanced on her hip. They both looked like refugees from a domestic disaster. Mom, I'm sorry to bother you so early, but we need help. There it was, the crisis that would justify everything that followed. I'd been wondering what form their desperation would take. Apparently, it was going to be dramatic. What happened? I asked without inviting them inside. Not yet. Kyle lost his job yesterday. The company is downsizing, and he was one of the last hires. She dissolved into fresh tears, which felt a bit theatrical considering Kyle had been complaining about his boss for months. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it. Come inside. I led them into the kitchen and poured Brina a cup of coffee while Jake immediately made his way to my cookie jar. At least someone in the family had consistent priorities. How bad is it? I asked, sitting across from her at my small table. Bad, really bad. We've got the mortgage, the car payments, Emma's dance classes, Jake's daycare. Kyle's severance will maybe cover 6 weeks if we're careful. She wiped her nose with a tissue that had clearly been through a lot. Already this morning. 6 weeks. That was either shockingly poor financial planning or an exaggeration designed to increase urgency. Given their history of living beyond their means, it was probably both. What about unemployment benefits? I asked. He'll get them, but it's not enough to cover everything. She hesitated, then said softly, Mom, I hate to ask, but we need money. She nodded miserably for just a moment. I saw my little girl again, the one who used to come to me with skinned knees and broken hearts, trusting that mommy could fix everything. That child had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by a woman who'd spent 3 years treating me like an embarrassing obligation. How much? I asked. Just enough to get us through until Kyle finds something. Maybe $3,000 a month for a few months. We'll pay you back as soon as we're on our feet again. $3,000 a month. That was $36,000 over a year, which, in this job market, was a very real possibility. It was also exactly the kind of ongoing support that would create a financial dependency I suspected they'd never want to end. Let me ask you something, Brina, I said quietly. If I hadn't turned out to be wealthy, what would you have done? She looked genuinely confused. I don't know. Borrowed from someone else. Sold the house. Downsized your lifestyle. Made the hard choices people in financial crisis usually have to make. But you can afford to help us, she said, and there was something in her voice that made my stomach tighten. An entitlement that suggested my ability to help had somehow become my obligation to help. Yes, I said. I can afford it. But should I? Should you? She stared at me like I'd suggested leaving Jake on the side of the road. Mom, we're family. We are, I replied. And because we're family, I love you enough to ask whether giving you this money would actually help you in the long run. Jake, blissfully unaware of the tension, had discovered my tablet and was fully absorbed in a learning game I downloaded for his visits. Sweet boy. He deserved better than being used as a prop in his parents' financial drama. What do you mean? Brina asked. I mean that every time you and Kyle get in over your heads financially, someone bails you out. Your father when you bought too much house. His parents when that business venture failed. Me when you needed the wedding deposit. When does the pattern stop? This is different. This isn't our fault. Kyle losing his job isn't your fault, I said calmly. But being unable to survive 6 weeks without borrowing money absolutely is. You chose not to build an emergency fund. You chose to maintain a lifestyle you couldn't afford on one income. She started crying again, but this time it felt real. Less performance. More genuine distress. So you're saying no? She asked. You're going to let us lose our house? I'm saying I'll help you, I replied. Just not the way you're asking. I stood and retrieved my checkbook and a legal pad from the drawer. Brina watched me like someone awaiting a verdict. Here's what I'm willing to do, I said as I sat back down. I'll give you $15,000, not loan it. Give it to help with the immediate crisis and give Kyle time to find work. $15,000? Her voice dropped. That won't cover everything. No, it won't, I said. It will cover the absolute necessities while you make the hard choices you should have been making all along. I began listing them as I wrote the check. Sell the second car. Pull the kids out of expensive activities. Cancel the premium cable. Shop at discount stores instead of the upscale grocery chain. She stared at me in disbelief as the pen moved across the paper. This is a gift with one condition, I continued, tearing the check free but holding onto it. You get financial counseling. Both of you learn how to live within your means before you dig yourselves into another hole. But Mom, if you can afford more, I can afford a lot of things. Brina, I interrupted gently. What I won't afford is enabling you to avoid the consequences of poor financial planning. I held the check out between us. Take the $15,000 and the counseling requirement or find another solution. She stared at the check like it was both a lifeline and an insult. What if Kyle can't find work fast enough? Then you downsize your life until he does, I said. You'll learn what millions of families already know: you can survive on far less than you think. Silence settled between us while Jake continued playing peacefully, unaware that his future was being negotiated over coffee and tears. Finally, Brina reached for the check. Fine, she said quietly. We'll take it. And we'll do the counseling. I handed it over, but I wasn't naive enough to believe this was the end. This was only round one. They'd be back when $15,000 wasn't enough, with bigger emergencies and more desperate tears. But now, at least, I knew exactly where we stood, and more importantly, so did they. The financial counseling lasted exactly one session. I knew this because Dr. Patricia Hoffman called me personally 3 days after Brina and Kyle's appointment. Highly unusual, given patient confidentiality rules. But apparently, when someone storms out of a financial planning session screaming about manipulative mothers-in-law, exceptions get made. Mrs. Thompson, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. Dr. Hoffman said. Your daughter and son-in-law listed you as an emergency contact and frankly, I'm concerned about their attitude toward financial responsibility. I was in my garden. Deadheading Rose is one of those quiet, mindless tasks that lets you focus completely on someone else's drama. What happened? I asked. Well, she said. They spent most of the session explaining why their situation was temporary and exceptional, rather than examining the spending habits that made them vulnerable. When I suggested selling one of their vehicles, your son-in-law became quite agitated. I sighed softly. Let me guess, I said. He told you he needs the truck for work opportunities, among other things, Dr. Hoffman continued. He also said you were being unnecessarily harsh. Given your financial capacity to simply solve their problems, there it was even in therapy. Kyle was more focused on my obligation to clean up their mess than on their responsibility to change their behavior. Some people could find water in the dessert and still complain it wasn't chilled, Dr. Hoffman. I asked, did they talk about any concrete steps they're willing to take? Your daughter seemed more open to change, she said. But your son-in-law dominated the conversation. He kept circling back to the idea that family members should support each other unconditionally. Unconditionally, that was rich. Coming from a man who'd spent 3 years treating me like an incompetent burden. Right up until he discovered I wasn't actually broke. What's your professional assessment? I asked, honestly. They're seeking validation for their lifestyle choices, not real guidance for change. I've seen this pattern before. They'll likely look for another counselor who tells them what they want to hear. I wasn't surprised when my phone rang 20 minutes later. Brenna's number but Kyle's voice. Maggie. We need to talk about this counseling requirement. Hello to you too. Kyle, how did the session go? It was a waste of time. This woman clearly doesn't understand our situation. She suggested selling the truck, which is ridiculous. I need reliable transportation for job interviews. I said. And how many job interviews have you had so far? Silence. The market is tough right now, he finally said. It takes time to find the right opportunity. It's been 3 weeks, Kyle. Have you applied for anything? I'm not going to take just any job. I have skills, experience. I'm worth more than minimum wage. Worth more than minimum wage but not valuable enough to survive his company's downsizing. Worth more than minimum wage but apparently not worth enough to build an emergency fund. The cognitive dissonance was almost impressive. Kyle, let me ask you something, I said. If I weren't in the picture, what would you be doing right now? What do you mean? I mean if I didn't exist, if Brina didn't have a wealthy mother to fall back on. What would your plan be? Another pause. I guess we'd figure something out. You'd figure something out, I echoed. Probably by taking any job available while continuing to look for something better. Right, maybe, but because I do exist, I continued. You've decided that. Figuring it out means convincing me to subsidize your unemployment while you wait for the perfect position. That's not fair, isn't it? I asked calmly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my existence has become your excuse to avoid making hard decisions. I could hear Brina in the background, her voice urgent but muffled, probably reminding him that antagonizing the Bank of Margaret wasn't a smart move. Look, Kyle said, shifting into what he clearly thought was a reasonable tone. The counseling thing isn't working. This woman doesn't understand our real expenses. Maybe we should try a different approach. What kind of approach? Maybe you could help us directly instead of involving some stranger who doesn't know our family. There it was. They wanted to remove professional oversight and deal with me directly where emotional pressure could replace objective financial analysis. You mean help you avoid accountability while I subsidize your poor choices? I asked. I mean help your family during a crisis, Kyle, I said quietly. I've been thinking about this situation and I've realized something important. You're not in a crisis. What? You're in a transition and you're choosing to handle it irresponsibly. What's that supposed to mean? It means losing a job is unfortunate but manageable if you make smart choices. Refusing to make those choices because you expect someone else to solve your problems isn't a crisis. It's a character flaw. The silence that followed stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. Are you cutting us off? He finally asked. I'm requiring you to grow up, I replied. The 15,000 stands. The counseling requirement stands. And if you choose not to participate in real financial counseling, you're choosing not to receive any future assistance from me. You're really going to watch your own daughter lose her house? I'm going to watch my daughter learn to take responsibility for her choices, I said. There's a difference. After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching the afternoon shadows stretch across the lawn. Part of me felt awful for being so firm. The instinct to protect your child, to fix everything and shield them from consequences never really goes away. But a larger part of me felt something I hadn't felt in years, the quiet Steady satisfaction of setting healthy boundaries and holding them. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Mommy is crying and Daddy is yelling. Are you still mad at us? It broke my heart, but it also reminded me why boundaries were necessary. Children should never have to carry adult emotions or feel responsible for family money problems. I texted back, I'm not mad at you, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard decisions. You don't need to worry about any of this. Then I turned off my phone and went inside to plan my next business expansion. They sold the truck. I found out 3 weeks later when Emma called me, bubbling with excitement about their new adventure of sharing one car. Children have an incredible ability to find joy in situations that send adults into existential despair. Daddy walks to the grocery store now, Emma reported happily. He says it's good exercise. And Mommy drives him to job interviews when they're far away. It sounded like they were teenagers again out of the mouths of babes. Somehow, financial necessity had been reframed as romantic nostalgia. I had to admire the positive spin, even though I suspected Kyle was grinding his teeth with every step of those grocery store walks. That sounds very practical, I said, genuinely proud of them for making at least one adult decision. Are you going to come visit us soon? Emma asked. Mommy says you're probably too busy being rich. I closed my eyes. Even when they were trying to do better, they couldn't resist slipping passive-aggressive commentary through my granddaughter. Grandma's not too busy for you, sweetie, I said gently. But I am waiting for Mommy and Daddy to show me they're serious about making good choices. What kind of choices? How do you explain financial responsibility to a 7-year-old without making her feel responsible for her parents' problems? Grown-up choices, I said. About money and jobs and taking care of the family. 2 days later, Brina called me herself. Her voice sounded different, less performative than usual. Mom, Kyle found a job. That's wonderful, I said. What kind of work? It's not what he was hoping for, she admitted. Construction labor, not management. But it's 40 hours a week with benefits. He starts Monday. Something in her tone told me this hadn't been Kyle's first choice or an easy one for his ego. How does he feel about it? He's adjusting. The pay is less than his last job, but it's honest work. And we can make it work if we're careful. That phrase alone told me they'd finally started looking at real numbers, actual expenses versus actual income. More progress than I'd expected. I'm proud of you both, I said, and I meant it. Are you really? Her voice softened, vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard in a long time, as if my approval still mattered to her. Yes, I said. It takes courage to accept reality and work with it instead of fighting it. Kyle wants to apologize to you, she added. He realizes he's been difficult. A diplomatic word for his behavior, but I appreciated the attempt at accountability. I'd be happy to hear from him when he's ready. There's something else. Mom, we've been talking, really talking, about how we've treated you over the years. Before we knew about your business success, I set my coffee cup down and gave her my full attention. This felt like it might finally be real. I keep thinking about Christmas dinner, she continued. About what Kyle said about your knitting course. And I realized we've been dismissive of you for a long time. Not just about business, about everything, like when you tried to tell us about your book club. And we acted like it was cute that old ladies still read books, she said quietly. Or when you learned to use social media and we joked about grandmas on Facebook. We treated you like a stereotype instead of a person. It was more self-awareness than I'd heard from Brina in years. Still, I'd learned to be cautious about breakthroughs that could just as easily be strategy dressed up as growth. Why do you think that happened? I asked, honestly. Because it was easier, she said. If you were just our aging parent who needed managing, we didn't have to think about you having your own life, your own dreams and abilities. We could focus on ourselves without feeling guilty for neglecting you. The truth stung, but in the clean, clarifying way truth often does. Thank you for telling me that, I said quietly. I want to do better, Mom, we both do. I just don't know how to undo 3 years of being thoughtless. You don't undo the past, I said. You stop repeating it. That's enough. We talked for another hour for the first time in years. It felt like a real conversation, two adults speaking to each other with mutual respect. She told me about Kyle's wounded pride over taking a manual labor job, and how she'd had to remind him that providing for his family mattered more than protecting his image. She talked about the kids asking why they couldn't afford pizza anymore, and how she explained that sometimes families have to make sacrifices to stay together. By the time we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt with my daughter in a very long time. Hope. That evening, Kyle called. Maggie, I owe you an apology. His voice was subdued. No defensiveness. None of the aggression that had defined our recent conversations. I'm listening. I've been thinking about what you said about how I was using your existence as an excuse to avoid making hard decisions. You were right. I was so focused on the fact that you could fix our problems that I stopped trying to fix them myself. That takes courage to admit, I said. It takes desperation, he replied. We almost lost everything because I was too proud to accept the help that was actually available. While waiting for the help I wanted you to give, how do you feel about the new job? He let out a small laugh. Like my back is going to kill me for the first month, but also, like I forgot what it feels like to earn something instead of just expecting it. We talked for 20 minutes. I wasn't ready to forget 3 years of condescension, but I was willing to acknowledge that people can change when consequences finally catch up to their choices. After both calls, I sat in my office and stared at my business dashboard. Revenue was up 30% from the previous month. International expansion was ahead of schedule. Partnership requests were coming in from companies I'd only dreamed of working with 2 years earlier, and yet, hearing genuine accountability from my family felt like a bigger victory than any of those milestones. Still, I wasn't naive. Real change takes time, and people often backslide when pressure returns. I chose to celebrate the progress while staying realistic about human nature. After all, I hadn't built my wealth by being overly trusting. 6 months later, those carefully maintained boundaries were tested in a way I never could have imagined. I was in my office replying to emails from students when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Brenna's number, but when I answered, it was Kyle's voice. And he was barely coherent. Maggie, you need to come to the hospital right now. My blood ran cold. What happened? Are the kids okay? The kids are fine. It's Brenna. There was an accident at her work, some kind of chemical exposure in the lab where she does billing. They rushed her to Metropolitan General. I was already grabbing my keys. How bad? Bad. They won't tell me much because I'm not technically next of kin, just her husband. She's unconscious and they're running tests to figure out what she was exposed to. Brenna worked for a pharmaceutical company, handling insurance claims in a building that housed both administrative offices and research labs. The irony that she might be seriously hurt at the job she'd taken to stabilize their finances wasn't lost on me. 20 minutes later, I was in the hospital waiting room with Kyle, Emma, and Jake. The kids were quiet but not panicked, which told me Kyle had managed to explain things without terrifying them. What exactly happened? I asked Kyle while the children were distracted by a cartoon on the waiting room television. There was a ventilation failure in the research wing, he said. Several people were exposed to airborne chemicals before they could evacuate. Brenna was delivering paperwork to that department when it happened. How many people were affected? 6. 3 are conscious and seem okay. 2 are in serious condition. His voice cracked. Brenna still isn't responding. I set aside every resentment and frustration from the past year and focused on what mattered. My daughter was hurt. My family needed me. Have you spoken to her supervisor? I asked. The company should know exactly which chemicals were involved. They're being cagey, he said. Lots of talk about ongoing investigations and liability concerns. I think they're more worried about lawsuits than helping the victims. That sounded like corporate damage control, and it infuriated me. When my daughter's life might be at risk, Kyle, I said firmly, listen to me carefully. Don't sign anything the company gives you without reading it. Don't agree to any settlements or liability waivers. Document everything. I don't understand, Kyle said. If Brenna was injured because of negligent safety practices, you may need to pursue legal action to cover her medical costs and lost income. I didn't hesitate. These companies try to limit their exposure by pushing victims to waive their rights before they even understand the full extent of their injuries. Kyle stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking another language. You want me to sue her employer? I want you to protect your family's interests. Right now, you have no idea whether Brenna will have long-term health effects or how much her care will cost. Don't give up your legal options before you even know what you might need them for. Just then, a doctor appeared in the doorway, asking for Kyle. We followed him into a small consultation room where we could speak privately. Mrs. Hartley is stable, but she's still unconscious, Dr. Garrison explained. The chemical exposure caused severe respiratory irritation and possible neurological effects. We're monitoring her closely, but it's too early to say whether there will be lasting damage. What kind of neurological effects? I asked. Potential issues with memory, coordination, and concentration, he said. The chemicals involved are known to affect cognitive function, but the severity depends on the level and duration of exposure. Kyle went pale. Is she going to wake up? We expect her to regain consciousness within the next day or two, the doctor said. However, her recovery may be lengthy and she could require extensive rehabilitation. After the doctor left, Kyle sat in stunned silence while I processed what this could mean. If Brenna couldn't work for months, if she needed ongoing medical care, or ended up with a permanent disability, their fragile financial stability would collapse overnight. Kyle, I said gently, I know this is overwhelming, but you need to make some calls. What kind of calls? First, call your insurance company and find out exactly what's covered. Second, document everything times what the doctor said, what the company has told you. Third, start researching lawyers who specialize in workplace injury cases. I can't think about lawsuits right now. You can't afford not to, I said. If Brina can't work for 6 months, how are you going to manage financially? The question hit him like cold water. He'd been so focused on the immediate crisis that he hadn't thought beyond it. I don't know, he whispered. That's why you need legal protection, I said. The company will offer you a settlement designed to make this disappear as cheaply as possible. Don't take their first offer. Don't take their 10th offer until you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. What if I can't afford a lawyer? Most personal injury lawyers work on contingency. They only get paid if you win. I paused, watching him struggle to absorb everything. Kyle, I'll help with the immediate expenses so you can focus on Brenna's recovery. But long-term financial security has to come from holding the responsible parties accountable. You'd help us. Even after everything? You're my family, I said. When there's a real crisis, family shows up. That night, I took Emma and Jake back to my house so Kyle could stay at the hospital. As I tucked them into the guest beds, Emma asked the question I'd been dreading. Grandma Maggie, is Mommy going to die? No, sweetheart, I said softly. Mommy is sick, but the doctors are taking very good care of her. She's going to get better. It might just take some time. Are you going to help us? I smoothed her hair and thought about all the boundaries I'd set, all the tough love, all the lessons about consequences and responsibility. None of that mattered now. This wasn't about enabling bad choices or funding irresponsibility. This was about protecting my family when they were truly vulnerable through no fault of their own. Yes, honey, I said. Grandma's going to help. The lawsuit changed everything. Brina woke up 2 days later with memory gaps and persistent headaches that the doctors warned might be permanent. She couldn't remember the last 3 hours before the accident, struggled to follow complex conversations, and became so exhausted that working was impossible. But the company's response to our legal inquiries revealed something that made Kyle's jaw drop and made my business instincts kick into high gear. They knew. Our lawyer, Jonna Morrison, explained during our first meeting 2 weeks after the accident. The ventilation system was flagged for maintenance 6 months ago, but repairs were delayed to avoid shutting down the research wing during a critical project phase. They chose productivity over safety? Kyle asked. Not just chose it, Jonna said. There are emails from the facility's manager explicitly recommending the delay. Despite knowing the risks to personnel in adjacent areas, I leaned forward in my chair. What kind of risks did they know about? The exact type of exposure your daughter experienced, Jonna said. This wasn't an accident. It was a foreseeable consequence of a conscious decision to prioritize profits over worker safety. Kyle stared at her like she'd just announced aliens had landed. So this was preventable. Completely preventable with proper maintenance. And here's the interesting part, Jonna continued. Your daughter wasn't the only one to suffer long-term effects. 2 other employees are showing similar symptoms. And there's evidence the company has been pressuring them to accept inadequate settlements to avoid publicity. How inadequate? I asked. $20,000 each, Jonna said. For what could be permanent disabilities affecting their ability to earn a living for the rest of their lives. Kyle's face drained of color. $20,000. These people have been permanently injured through corporate negligence, and the company was offering barely enough to cover a year's worth of medical expenses. What should we be looking at for fair compensation? Kyle asked. Jonna consulted her notes. Given Brenna's age, earning potential, and the severity of her cognitive symptoms, we're looking at somewhere between $800, 0 and $1.2 million, possibly more if her condition doesn't improve. Kyle went so pale I thought he might faint. That much money. That was the cost to replace decades of lost earnings, medical care, pain and suffering, and punitive damages for corporate negligence. I was doing rapid calculations in my head. If this case was as strong as Jonna suggested and if there were multiple victims, the company was facing massive liability and would want to settle quickly and quietly. Jonna, what if we coordinated with the other victims? Present a unified case instead of letting them pick us off individually? That's exactly what I was thinking, Jonna said. Together, you have far more leverage than separately, but it could mean years of litigation instead of a quick settlement. Years? Kyle looked panicked. Or, Jonna continued, the company might offer a substantial settlement to make this go away. Before it becomes a public relations disaster. I turned to Kyle. What's Brenna's opinion? She gets confused when we try to explain the legal stuff, the cognitive effects. It's hard for her to focus on complex information for very long. My heart broke for her. But it also clarified my role in this situation. If my daughter couldn't advocate for herself, then I would advocate for her, Jana. What do you need from us to move forward with the coordinated approach? Patience, mostly, she said, and financial resources to cover expenses while we build the case. Kyle looked at me meaningfully, but I was already nodding. Whatever it takes. 6 months later, we were in settlement negotiations. The company had tried everything denying negligence, claiming employees were partially responsible, arguing that cognitive effects were pre-existing but none of it worked. Jana Morrison was ruthless and the evidence was overwhelming. The real turning point came when a former employee contacted Jana, providing information that changed the scope of the case entirely. This isn't the first time. Dr. Sarah Chen explained during a conference call. I left the company 8 years ago because they repeatedly ignored safety protocols. There were 3 other incidents involving chemical exposures, all covered up with non-disclosure agreements and inadequate settlements. Covered up how? Jana asked. Employees were told the exposure levels weren't dangerous, that any symptoms were coincidental. Anyone who pushed for proper medical evaluation was suddenly laid off for unrelated reasons. Kyle and I exchanged glances. This was bigger than one incident of corporate negligence. This was a pattern of systematically endangering workers and covering up the consequences. Do you have documentation? Jana asked. I kept everything, Dr. Chen said. Safety reports, emails, medical records. I always suspected someone would eventually need proof. That night, Kyle called me from the hospital where he'd been visiting Brina. Maggie, I need to tell you something and I don't know how you're going to react. I'm listening, I said. Before all this happened, before Brenna's accident, I thought you were being cruel. Withholding help when you could afford it, forcing us to struggle when struggle wasn't necessary. Watching how you've handled this situation, seeing how you immediately stepped up when we faced something we genuinely couldn't control. I realized I completely misunderstood what you were trying to teach us. What do you think I was trying to teach you? I asked. That there's a difference between helping and enabling. That real help prepares people to handle challenges. It doesn't shield them from ever having to face challenges. It was the most perceptive thing I'd heard Kyle say in the 3 years I'd known him. I prompted, and if you'd just taken the money every time we asked for it, we never would have learned to be resourceful or resilient. When this real crisis hit, we would have been completely helpless instead of just partially helpless. I smiled. Even though he couldn't see it over the phone. Kyle, you've learned something that some people never figure out. The difference between a crisis and an inconvenience. Brina losing her job because she made poor choices would have been an inconvenience. We tried to turn into your emergency, he said quietly. Brina being injured through corporate negligence is an actual crisis that requires real help. Exactly. I owe you an apology, Maggie, not just for this year, but for every year since I married your daughter. I've been so focused on what you could do for us that I never appreciated what you were trying to teach us. After we hung up, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, thinking about the settlement negotiations scheduled for next week. Jana was confident we could get close to $2 million, which would secure Brenna's future and send a message to other companies that worker safety wasn't optional. But more than the money, I was proud that Kyle finally understood the difference between support and dependency, between love and enabling. Some lessons can only be learned through experience. The settlement check arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 18 months after Brenna's accident, $2.4 million, covering medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and punitive damages designed to make sure the company never again chose profits over worker safety. But that wasn't the real story. The real story began 3 days later when Kyle called me with an unexpected confession. Maggie, there's something I need to tell you about the original $15,000 you gave us. I was in my office reviewing quarterly business reports that showed my knitting empire had expanded to 12 countries. Success had become routine enough that Kyle's serious tone immediately caught my attention. What about it? We never spent it. I set down my coffee cup. What do you mean you never spent it? I mean, it's been sitting in our savings account for over a year untouched. Kyle, that doesn't make sense. You said you needed it for mortgage payments and basic expenses. We did need it, he admitted, but the day after you gave it to us, something you said kept bothering me. You asked what we would have done if you didn't exist. And I realized we'd never actually tried to find out. I was completely confused. So, what did you do? We pretended the money didn't exist. We figured out how to live on just my construction wages. We sold stuff, cut expenses, took the kids out of expensive activities, learned to shop at discount stores. But why keep the money if you weren't going to use it? because having it there made us feel safe enough to make the hard changes. Knowing we had a safety net made it possible to walk the tightrope. I was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. So, when Brina had her accident, we still had your $15. Zero plus almost a year's worth of savings from living below our means. We weren't financially devastated by her inability to work, because we'd finally learned to live on less than we made. This was not at all what I'd expected to hear, Kyle. Are you telling me you've been financially stable this entire time? While I thought you were struggling, we were struggling at first, he admitted. But we got our act together faster than either of us thought possible. Once we stopped looking for someone else to solve our problems, I thought about all the conversations we'd had over the past year. All the times I'd offered additional help that they'd politely declined. All the assumptions I'd made about their situation. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because we wanted to prove we could handle a real crisis before we admitted we'd figured out how to handle normal life. Brenna's accident was our test and we passed. Now we want to give you back your $15,000 plus interest. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Kyle, you don't owe me interest on a gift. Maybe not, he said, but we owe you an explanation of what that gift actually bought us. And that was time to grow up, space to fail without catastrophic consequences. Proof that we were more capable than we'd given ourselves credit for. Keep the money, I said. Put it toward the kids' college funds. Are you sure? I'm sure, but Kyle, I'm curious about something. What changed your mind about accepting help versus learning independence? There was a long pause. You want the honest answer? Always. It was watching you build your business. Seeing how you transformed yourself from someone we thought needed our protection into someone who clearly didn't need anyone's protection. It made me realize that accepting limitation was a choice, not an inevitability. Tears pricked my eyes. That might be the nicest compliment anyone's ever given me. It's the truth. You didn't just refuse to be diminished by our assumptions about your capabilities. You used our doubt as motivation to prove us wrong, and you decided to do the same thing with your financial situation. Exactly. Instead of accepting that we'd always need bailouts, we decided to prove we could stand on our own. That evening, I drove to their house for the first family dinner we'd shared since the previous Christmas. The difference was remarkable. Kyle looked genuinely confident instead of defensively aggressive. Brina, despite her ongoing recovery from the chemical exposure, seemed more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. The children were their usual chaotic selves, but the undercurrent of adult stress that had always permeated their household was gone. Mom, Brina said as we finished dinner, I need to apologize for something. What's that? Sweetheart, all those years we treated you like you were declining, like you needed our management and protection. I think we were actually describing ourselves. How do you mean? We were the ones who were failing to thrive. We were the ones who needed help with basic life skills. But it was easier to project that onto you than admit our own incompetence. Kyle nodded. We made you the problem so we didn't have to acknowledge that we were the problem. And now, I asked, now we're not problems anymore. We're just people figuring out how to live well. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the strange journey our family had taken. I'd set out to teach them about financial responsibility, and ended up learning something about my own capacity for reinvention. They'd started by resenting my boundaries and ended up grateful for the space those boundaries created for their own growth. But the real revelation had nothing to do with money or business success, or even family dynamics. It had to do with the discovery that people are capable of far more than they believe possible, but only if someone they love refuses to accept their limitations as permanent. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the refusal to rescue them from the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to become someone worth refusing to rescue. 6 months later, Kyle started his own construction business. Brina, working within the limitations of her injury, became a part-time consultant for workplace safety firms. Emma learned to knit from my online tutorials and started a small business selling friendship bracelets to her classmates, and I continued building my empire, traveling to conferences around the world and living a life that would have been unimaginable to the woman who sat at that Christmas dinner table 2 years ago, listening to her son-in-law mock her ambitions. But the best part wasn't the business success or the financial freedom, or even the vindication of proving my doubters wrong. The best part was having a family that finally saw me clearly, not as a burden to be managed or a resource to be exploited, but as a person worthy of respect, capable of growth, and deserving of love that didn't depend on my utility to their lives. And that, more than any amount of money, was worth everything I'd gone through to earn it. Now, I'm curious. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who took you for granted? How did you find the courage to value yourself when others didn't? Share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of transformation and triumph. The truth is, it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Sometimes you just have to stop letting other people convince you that your best years are behind you.